All right, so let's go ahead and finish up our discussion of taste by talking about something that was described by Michael Pollan in The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is a pretty famous book that he wrote. So what is the Omnivore's Dilemma? Well, this comes from his book that he wrote several years ago. Basically, The Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of Four Meals. He basically reports that we have a wide variety of choices in terms of the food that we eat. So how do we figure out what a healthy diet is? And he sums this up in another book called In Defense of Food. He basically says, eat food. So he means like real food, like things that actually grow in the ground or on trees or come from animals. So eat food, not too much, mostly plants. But it brings up a really important question. How do we use our different senses to help us select food that is safe? Well, for example, with our sense of smell, most of the time, we can use our sense of smell to figure out whether the milk's gone bad or whether chicken has gone bad. Please take it from me, folks. If the meat smells bad, cooking it will not make that smell go away. It will still be bad. It will just be cooked. Don't eat it. But we're largely going to focus on how we can use taste to actually help us select safe food. So taste and smell work together, as we've talked about. So smell helps us identify objects in the environment. It can provide cues on what's safe or unsafe to eat. That includes the smell of bad meat, rancid meat, bad vegetables, rotten fruit, sour milk. Taste can help us identify what is called a nutrient or what we would consider an anti-nutrient, something that is not helpful for us, but is rather harmful for us. And it's been suggested that each of our four tastes is responsible either for a nutrient or an anti-nutrient. So for example, bitter helps us detect poison. We don't necessarily need to have the different types of bitter distinguished. We just need to know that bitter generally equals bad. Sour helps us detect acids, which are also anti-nutrients and can be harmful to us in large quantities. And then sweet and salty help us get nutrients that we need. So this does seem to be hardwired in a way. So we know that from infancy, infants prefer sweet tastes. As you can see here, this baby is really loving this mashed sweet potato, but do not really like the sour taste as seen with this Granny Smith apple. So there does seem to be a hardwired preference, at least for sweet tastes initially on. So this kind of leads to the development of a theory known as the specific hungers theory. So basically the idea is that a deficiency of a nutrient will provoke a craving for that nutrient. So if you lack sodium, you'll want pretzels and chips and salty food. And on the surface, this doesn't seem like a bad idea. So for example, it's often suggested that when you're running for a long period of time, if you're running for over 45 minutes, that you should probably get something really sweet in your system, some sugar to help your body get the energy that it needs. And that could be Gatorade, that could be different types of sports gels. I ran a 10K a couple of weeks ago, and about 45 minutes into it, I started pounding a few Sour Patch Kids to get the sugar I needed so I could keep that energy going. So there might be something to this specific hungers theory, but I can tell you I'm a lot more likely to crave salty foods when I'm thirsty, not because I want sodium. And so one of the things that we find is that we require a variety of nutrients which do not have specific tastes associated with them. So for example, we need vitamin B12. How is that in terms of a flavor? We need vitamin D. We need vitamin C. How do we get those in terms of flavor? There's not necessarily a specific taste associated with the different types of nutrients we need, like iron or zinc or magnesium or things like that. And additionally, A specific hungers theory would imply that if you are deficient in a certain vitamin, you should crave that vitamin. And we typically find that we don't get a craving for vitamins. What we tend to find is we get a craving for something else. So for example, if you're iron deficient, if you're low in iron, we actually find that what often ends up happening is that you develop something called pica. So you might want to eat things like ice cubes or ice chips or chew on paper or chew on foil. Is iron present in any of those substances? No, not at all. But it does typically underlie somebody who is iron deficient. So this doesn't really fit with the specific hungers theory. I've never sat there and said, you know, I really need some vitamin B12 in my diet. So what do more modern theories suggest? So we have to consider the role of learning. We tend to learn to prefer or avoid foods based on the consequences of them. And this can be transferred to neutral foods. Most people don't necessarily want tea, but people like sugar. And if you put sugar in iced tea, all of a sudden they want the iced tea. So this is called evaluative conditioning. I've never had a bad experience from a sweet food. I've had a lot of bad experiences from bitter foods or new foods that I'd never tried before. And because of that, I'm going to be more likely to avoid those in the future. So we tend to regulate our intake through a combination of hardwired preferences for things like sweet and salty foods and learned responses to different types of flavors. So for example, part of the reason I don't really like spicy foods is not necessarily because I don't like the taste, but because my stomach hates me every time I do it. So what I've learned is that generally spicy foods are probably things that my weak little stomach should avoid. Times have changed. So one of the things that we are finding with the types of foods that we eat is that food is plentiful and it's readily available. And one of the things that we're going to find, I would highly recommend checking out the book Salt, Sugar, Fat. It was written by Michael Moss in 2013, and it's basically all about, especially in the 20th century, how our cravings for salt and sugar have basically been utilized and manipulated by different components of the food industry to basically get us to eat more food. So things that you would never expect to be pumped full of sugar, like bread, can be full of it. Oftentimes, certain foods are going to be pumped with extra milk. Oftentimes, low-fat foods contain extra sugar. So there's a lot of research that we can basically hijack people's senses and their preferences by pumping them into these high processed foods. And additionally, what we're finding is that basically our need for salt and sugar has been manipulated against us. We probably eat way more junk and way more processed food than we used to. And let's be really clear here. I like processed food. Of course I do. I like sweet and salty foods quite a bit. I had a couple of snickerdoodles today, but it's important to not eat those all the time. The big problem with how times have changed and this preference for cheaper, easy processed food that's pumped full of sugar, salt, and fat is that we don't eat enough vegetables. It's a lot harder for us to detect the nutrients in vegetables, and because of that, we don't really get hungers for vegetables. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, back in 2017, actually ended up reporting that about 12% of Americans eat the daily minimum daily fruit recommendation of 1.5 to 2 cups per day. Only 9% consume the minimum daily vegetable recommendation of 2 to 3. Most Americans are not eating their vegetables. This is more likely to happen for men, young adults, and people that live in poverty. They have really low rates of fruit and vegetable intake. So this is a bit of a problem because there are certain types of nutrients that are certainly more plentiful in vegetables that we're not getting because our systems have basically been hijacked by junk food. So now let's kind of move on to talk about our supposed fifth taste, and I put a question mark because we're not sure, known as umami. Umami is partially based on the detection of monosodium glutamate, or MSG. This typically signals that protein is present. Glutamate is part of a protein molecule. And so umami is often kind of an earthier, sort of meaty taste. So it's been suggested you can find it in meat, especially things like fresh chicken, possibly even mushrooms. Now, this seems to fit with the idea that this flavor and taste indicates a nutrient that we need. For those of you that have had me in other classes, especially biopsych, you know that glutamate is a critical neurotransmitter for learning, memory, and different aspects of sensory reception. The problem with this being a fifth taste is that unlike our detection for nutrients and anti-nutrients, it's not hardwired. And additionally, it's really difficult to detect in food. Now, one of the things that we will find is that MSG is more likely to be in different types of seasoning. Chinese food kind of gets a bum rap with this. So if you go to any Chinese restaurant, typically what you will find, especially the ones that are around the mall food court, they report not having any MSG. And it was believed for a while that MSG could be really dangerous. In small doses, it's okay, but there are people who are sensitive to MSG. And so larger doses can lead to things like headaches, numbness, flushing, and so on. I just find it really interesting that the Chinese restaurants are the ones that get the blame, whereas I have several different types of seasoning. I think I have like a smoky seasoning that I sometimes use for my French fries, and I'm pretty sure it has MSG in it, and I've never seen warning, this has MSG. So I find that kind of interesting. Now, when we talk about taste, we also have to consider the feel of food and the texture of food. And that also includes tasting fat. So odds are pretty good if you tried, you might notice a texture difference between foods that are high in fat or have a normal amount of fat versus those that have it reduced. So a full fat ice cream versus something like a frozen yogurt, or full fat milk versus skim milk. Generally what we're going to find is that fat is too large of a molecule to actually stimulate taste or smell, but it is a very critical nutrient, just like protein is. But like we saw with smell, fat molecules are large enough to actually stimulate the trigeminal nerve, which is a part of our somatosensory aspect related to our face. So when we eat fat, we actually get a bit of a tactile sensation as a result. And some of those fats may actually end up being partially digested in the process. Generally, what we do find is that digesting fat in our gut actually does produce a preference for fat-containing foods. And generally, foods that have more fat tend to be a little creamier. They tend to have a little bit of a richer or more luxurious sort of texture to them that low-fat foods really don't. So one more thing, do you like spicy food? I don't. It hurts my stomach. But for chili peppers and hot foods and things like that, most infants are not born liking them. This is another case where, like our preference for certain types of odors, social influence plays a very large role. And one of the things that we find is that liking the burn of chili peppers is something that only humans do. So interestingly enough, hot pepper or chili powder or red pepper can actually be quite a deterrent to your pets. So when I first got my cat, he liked to bat at one of the door stoppers on my door, and it would make a noise that would wake me up in the middle of the night. One of the ways that I very quickly taught him not to mess around with that or try to rub his face on it or make noise with it was to rub some cayenne pepper on it. Cats don't like pepper, and so he learned to stay away. So liking the burn of chili peppers, like loving those flaming hot Cheetos and Takis and stuff like that, or really spicy Indian or Thai food. When I go to restaurants, I get a 2 out of 10 because I'm a wimp. We tend to find that this liking of spicy food is variable across individuals. It may relate to the number of fungiform papillae you have, kind of like super tasters. One thing that we do also know is that liking chili peppers can be incredibly valuable. Hot peppers tend to contain a chemical called capsaicin, which actually temporarily dulls the pain response. So folks, that was our very last lecture for sensation and perception. I hope you had a wonderful semester. I hope you learned a lot. Get that extra credit to me. Tell me your favorite scent and your least favorite scent, and I will be sending you more information about your optional cumulative final very soon. Take care.